Hi, welcome to the third installment of the CPRA Law and Tech webinar series. I am Sherry Porath Rockwell, and I'm a privacy lawyer at Sidley Austin and in their California offices. And I am coming to you today as the chair of the privacy law section of the California Lawyers Association, which is essentially the State Bar Association. And we're welcome to all lawyers who want to join us. And we have many interesting programs and opportunities. It's my great honor and pleasure to present this series with you, or to host it rather, with Stacey Gray of the Future of Privacy Forum. And I'm going to turn it over to Stacey now.
Thank you so much, Sherry. As I get to the next screen here, there we go. My name is Stacey Gray. I'm the Director of Legislative Research and Analysis at the Future of Privacy Forum. We are a nonprofit global consumer privacy organization dedicated to responsible business practices and informed public policy. And a lot of our work is educational, just like this. So we're very excited to be partnering with the California Lawyers Association on this series on law and tech. We're running this every Friday from mid-February through end of March, focusing on a different topic each week. And this week, very excited to be talking about online advertising. It has always been my personal opinion that online advertising and ad tech generally is one of the core foundational technology issues to understand in order to understand privacy legislation. Sometimes, unfortunately, sometimes we focus too much on ad tech, but it really, really is central to that privacy legislative debate. And so very excited to be doing an educational session on it today. But these are the other sessions. We're going to be talking dark patterns next week. And the week after that, we'll do a deeper dive on universal opt-outs and global privacy controls. So very excited about that. And overall, this session, even though we start each one with a bit of information about the emerging laws, the bulk of the session today and each week will actually not be about law at all. It will be about the business practices and the technologies that lawyers should understand in order to do this kind of work. What do lawyers need to know about technology? So let me turn it actually back over to you, Sherry, to introduce our speaker who's going to start us off.
Okay, terrific. First, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. As you may have noticed when you logged on, the session is being recorded, so be aware of that. And also, we will have time for questions, and we are taking questions in the Q&A section, not so much the chat. So if you have questions along the way, just put them in the Q&A. And just to preempt a question that's always asked, the recording of this will be made available, as will the slides. So we will do that after the session. Okay, it is my another pleasure to introduce Taylor Bloom. Taylor is a privacy lawyer at Baker Hostetler, also here in California. And she is the chair of the California Lawyers Association Privacy Law Section's Ad Tech Committee and does many other things. But today she's going to share with us an overview of what CPRA and the other emerging state data privacy laws have to say about ad tech and online advertising. So over to you, Taylor.
Everyone, I'm going to provide a quick overview of the 3 new laws coming into effect in 2023 and how they impact ad tech. So first up, we have the California Privacy Rights Act, which is essentially a red line of the California Consumer Privacy Act. The CPRA provides a new right to opt out of sharing for cross-context behavioral advertising, which we'll talk about further. Next up, we have the Colorado Privacy Act, which provides consumers the right to opt out of targeted advertising. And lastly, we have the Virginia Consumer Data Processing Act, which also provides, Data Protection Act, which also provides consumers the right to opt out of targeted advertising. Most importantly, all 3 of these laws give consumers the right to exercise controls around behavioral or targeted digital advertising, but they all preserve the ability for businesses to engage in contextual advertising. So to start us off there, behavioral or targeting advertising is the tracking of a consumer's activities online. So this can include searches the consumers conducted, web pages they visited, content they viewed, and this is used to deliver advertising targeted to that individual consumer's interest. This is also sometimes called interest-based advertising. Contextual advertising, on the other side, involves placing ads on pages based on the content of those pages. So for example, contextual advertising would be placing an ad for running shoes on a running forum. I'm not going to go too much further into contextual advertising versus behavioral advertising, but Adam and Christy are going to cover the differences between these two types of advertising in more depth during their presentation. Next slide, please. All right. So first up, we're going to talk about the CPRA and the right for consumers to opt out of sharing for cross-context behavioral advertising. So the CPRA introduces the term sharing as distinct activity from selling personal information. So under the CCPA, as I'm sure many of you know, consumers have the right to opt out of selling personal information. Now we have this term sharing. So sharing is defined as disclosing or otherwise communicating a consumer's personal information for cross-context behavioral advertising. There are two key components to the definition of sharing. First, there's explicit language that sharing, unlike selling, doesn't require any consideration. And second, the purpose for the transfer must be cross-context behavioral advertising. And while it's important to note that while the definition of share is limited to an ad tech context and doesn't require consideration, the CPRA doesn't resolve the debate between the differing positions offered by the leading ad industry bodies, the IAB and the DAA, relating to the sale and now sharing of personal information in ad tech context. And so the CPRA also creates this new term, cross-context behavioral advertising. It's essentially defined as advertising targeted to a consumer based on personal information obtained from the consumer's activity across businesses, distinctly branded websites, apps, or services, except for the consumer's activity across the actual business with which the consumer is intentionally interacting. Basically, this is targeting ads using data gathered from a consumer's interactions across third-party sites or platforms. Important to note here is that cross-context behavioral advertising is explicitly excluded as a business purpose that can be performed by a service provider. So basically, these new provisions governing the sharing of personal information, these are definitely an attempt to give consumers the ability to limit how their personal information is used for targeted advertising. So under the CPRA, consumers are going to have the right to opt out of this type of targeting, and businesses that share consumers' personal information for cross-context behavioral advertising are going to be required to provide a clear and conspicuous link where consumers can opt out of the sharing of their personal information. These links are going to have to be on a business's homepage and label "Do not sell or share my personal information." The CPRA also permits businesses to recognize an opt-out preference signal sent with the consumer's consent by a platform, technology, or mechanism. This is likely synonymous with the Global Privacy Control, or GPC. And for CPRA purposes, the signal should permit consumers to opt out of the sale or sharing of their personal information. Next slide, please. So next up, we have the CDPA. So the CDPA provides consumers the right to opt out of targeted advertising, which is generally the same thing as cross-context behavioral advertising. The CDPA does provide clarity on the types of advertising that are permitted and do not constitute targeted advertising. The right to opt out of targeted advertising under the Colorado Privacy Act and the CDPA are very similar to the right to opt out of the sharing of personal information under the CPRA. For example, each right includes an exception for advertising to users based on their own activity and interactions on the controller's own website or app, and this is not considered cross-context behavioral advertising. In addition, each right clarifies that if a controller ingests personal data from a third party and combines it with its own user's personal data, that would constitute targeted advertising under each statute. The CDPA is careful to specifically exclude a few items from the definition of targeted advertising. This includes ads delivered based on specific and unambiguous opt-in by consumers, ads delivered based on activities on the data controller's own website and/or apps, and the act of processing personal data strictly for the sake of measuring and reporting. Next slide, please. All right, so lastly, we have the Colorado Privacy Act and the right to opt out of targeted advertising. So the CPA provides a nearly identical right to opt out of targeted advertising, just like the CDPA. The only difference with the CPA definition is that it includes personal data inferred over time instead of just obtained. The other significant difference under the CPA is that it explicitly requires controllers to honor universal opt-out signals for targeted advertising. So starting July 1st, 2024, controllers are going to have to allow consumers to opt out of targeted advertising and/or sales through a universal opt-out mechanism. It's going to have to meet technical specifications that are going to be established by the state AG. We don't have them yet. For example, though, the global privacy control that I mentioned under the CPRA that was recently endorsed by the California AG, if it's programmed to opt out users of targeted ads in this context, it will likely satisfy this requirement. The Colorado AG, though, has until July 1st of 2023 to promulgate CPA regulations that establish the technical specifications that a universal opt-out signal must meet. And lastly, the CPA specifies that controllers must provide a clear and conspicuous method for consumers to exercise the right to opt out of targeted advertising or sales of personal data. This also must be in the controller's privacy notice, as well as in a readily accessible location outside the privacy notice. I know that was a lot and we tried to cram it all into like 10 minutes as fast as we could, but if anyone has questions, I am definitely available. We'll share my contact information. We can kind of dive into this further if anyone has further thoughts and questions, but otherwise I'm going to turn us over to Christy and Adam.
Thank you so much, Taylor. That was excellent. A very good ground setting for why we're talking about this today and why people should care. Before we get to the main presentation, let me just ask, because I can't actually see the Q&A right now. Sherry, my co-host, are there any questions for Taylor? We probably have time for maybe one.
There is one question from another California Privacy Section member. To what extent should privacy policies and do not sell or share pages account for Google Analytics data collection? I actually think that's kind of like a legal opinion. So I'm not sure that Taylor, well, I'll just throw it over to Taylor if she wants to try to discuss that. But
I'll give a very general response and kind of defer this, but Jared, we're totally open to discuss this with you further offline. I will say that for Google Analytics, you know, under the CCPA right now, Google Analytics can operate as your service provider so long as you have agreed to Google's data processing agreement. It is very unknown how that's going to work under CPRA. I too am very curious how Google's going to handle this. If someone knows the answer though, please add it to the Q&A. If anyone works at Google and can tell us what is Google going to do about sharing under CPRA, I think everyone really wants to know. I know I want to know, but I'd say that's an unknown right now.
Awesome. Thanks, Taylor. I think we're going to switch gears a little bit, but let me just invite you, Taylor, to stick around if you'd like to for the end for the Q&A, because you're also an expert in this topic. I know a lot of people who are listening to this webinar live and after the fact are spending a lot of time with in-house and outside counsel, understanding the different laws that are emerging. We're going to shift gears a little bit for the next 45 minutes, because another thing that we commonly hear in-house is, I've got the tools I need to figure out the law, but I just don't know how it works. How does ad tech work? And so that's what we're going to be talking about for the next 45 minutes. And we've got plenty of time for questions. I'll relay them live as we're going, if it's a clarifying question, or we'll get to the agenda at the end. Let me first briefly introduce, though, our two co-speakers, if we want to go back to their names. Christy Harris My colleague at the Future of Privacy Forum is the Director of Technology and Privacy Research at FPF, where she leads a lot of our internal research and efforts on issues of data privacy and advertising, including mobile apps and platforms. Prior to joining FPF, though, Christy actually spent 19 years at AOL, navigating some of the novel consumer privacy issues in the development of things like AOL Mail and advertising.com and MapQuest. And don't ask her AOL screen name, though. She won't tell you. And the other awesome guest speaker that I'm excited to introduce to you is Adam Tovim. Adam is a partner at the Chameleon Collective. He's an interim marketing leader with very deep expertise in customer data analytics. He's led growth strategies for companies like Salesforce, LiveRamp, JumpTap, Waystar. So Adam is a strategic advisor and independent voice on this. He knows some of the most about ad tech besides Christy, of anyone that I know. And I'll also add that he is a member of the faculty at Brandeis University, where he teaches on this and many other issues. So Christy and Adam, very excited to have you. And let me turn it over to you for the presentation.
Thank you so much, Stacy. I am so happy to be here with you. And I think Adam and I are up to the challenge to compete with Taylor on how quickly we can run through the most content to be of value to our audience today. We are going to try and give you a deep dive into, or basic deep dive into ad tech, to give you some terminology, familiarize you with some of the practices, the data flows, and some of the business models. And I am so glad that Taylor and Sherry and Stacy, you are all here to provide the policy perspectives so that we only have to do the actual technology pieces of it. And we have allowed time at the end for Q&A, so hopefully we'll be able to intersperse questions as we go and then have time for more questions at the end. But with that, I'm going to jump directly into the basics of how data flows on the internet. So if we take just a look at the very basic interaction of a user going to their browser and typing in a URL or the web address of where they want to go. In this case, I'm using BuzzFeed as an example because it is a familiar brand, not because I'm calling them out as a specific brand. So just use it as an example of going to the internet, typing in BuzzFeed.com into your browser, and then watching as my slides progress inappropriately. When you hit the enter key after typing the address in your browser, a connection is made to the BuzzFeed servers in this case. And then the browser, once that connection is made, has the ability to then send some information that will be used by that server to provide the actual web page back. This information includes things that you would expect, like the operating system, the type of browser being used, the size of your display, and some basic information that allows for the display of the content. It also includes information, if you visited this website before, any cookies that have been set. The information that is stored in those cookies will also be sent over to the website server. And then the server is able to return instructions to the browser that allows the browser to actually display the content. And this will include both the content that is from that website server that will be, for example, the article that you want to read, but also things that you may not be as familiar with, like fonts or plugins, if there's a commenting widget or some sort of analytics that's provided by another party. All of that is fed back in order to present that website that you see. And this conversation happens with every party on a website, every website you go to. So it happens in split seconds. You hopefully, if it's configured properly, don't even realize it, but these conversations happen constantly with every connection. And I present this because this will be the basis for the entirety of the interactions, both from a visiting of a publisher's site or from an advertisement being presented on a website. So when I talk about first and third parties presenting content on a website, as lawyers, you're probably very familiar with content or first and third parties from a legal perspective, and from whether or not they are legally a first or third party. And there may be contracts that would allow an entity or a partner to be considered operating in the capacity of a first party. But browsers and in the technology space, it is not that nuanced. It is actually very binary, and a browser looks at a first party as the entity that is the website that you typed in. So in the BuzzFeed example, BuzzFeed.com is the first party. And even if BuzzFeed has relationships with other entities to provide services on their behalf, for example, analytics or commenting widgets, those entities can be considered third parties. The browser sees that content coming from a different domain and qualifies them as a third party. This is very important when you are looking at the way that relationships are set up from a contractual perspective, or looking at these privacy issues from a policy perspective, that first and third parties are not the same definitions from a legal and a technological perspective. So when I talked about cookies, cookies themselves are not nefarious. They are not a bad thing. They do not themselves do something bad. What they are is a mechanism for storing information within the browser, so that a website can recognize the same individual user and preferences that may have been stored, or other personalization over time for future visits. And I look at it like a Post-it note. The website writes a message on a Post-it note, and the next time you come back to it, the information that is on that note can be read. And that is the purpose of a cookie. So how are cookies set and read? Well, the first time that you go to BuzzFeed, you probably didn't have a cookie. So there is that conversation that happens with the website server. And because there is no cookie, the website server can return back instructions that say, save a cookie that contains 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And the next time you visit BuzzFeed, the browser has that conversation with the web server, and it sends over the content of the cookies that are stored, and it is able to say, this is user 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The server is then able to return content that it may determine is relevant based on the fact that it knows something about the user. And I've provided an example here. If you were to use your Chrome browser and to look at what a cookie looks like in a browser context, this is basically what you see within your developer tools. There's a variety of different cookies here. This was the first time I visited BuzzFeed.com on a clean browser, and these are a sampling of the cookies that were set. And it has a name. You can see that the value is the content of the cookies. Sometimes you can understand what it says, sometimes you cannot. Often it is just a string of characters that represent a unique ID that means something to that web server, but may not mean anything to you as a layman just reading the content of it. So cookies themselves are not a terrible thing. It's what the companies that are setting the cookies do with the information and the customizations, personalization that they might do as a result of knowing who a user is over time and on multiple visits. So I mentioned that websites are able to have connections with third parties and have that conversation with each visit. You may have heard of tags, pixels, web beacons, web bugs, a variety of different names, but the functionality is at its most basic, simply just a mechanism for allowing another party to be able to have that conversation on a website when they are not the first party. Often it can be done for things like analytics or for other reporting. And it basically takes either a 1 by 1 or a 0 by 0 pixel, invisible to the naked eye. But because it has to be presented on a web page, it facilitates that conversation that happens where there is a connection to a web server, the transfer of data, and information can be passed back and forth, including the setting of cookies or reading of cookies. And from here, I'm going to hand over to Adam, who's going to tell us about all the companies who are doing these sorts of things.
Yes, thank you, Christy. And there are a lot of companies doing this. So we're going to go through the evolution of how did we get to so many companies, because I think for most people, it does mess with their mind a little bit how fractured a value chain the ad tech industry has grown into. So in order to do this, though, it's important to have some historical context. If you go back to when the first digital online ad was delivered, all the way back to 1994 with a banner ad, Back then, if you were an advertiser over on the right-hand side, you ultimately, your goal was to connect with a potential customer, to connect with your audience. And the best way to do that was to contract with an agency. And ultimately, you were required to form a direct relationship with some of the digital publishers. You may remember Yahoo being a very early internet website back then, and a number of other, early websites. And really, I mean, you can see actually one of the first, really, it's considered the first banner ad ever, is right there. The graphic was there, but it's still the same technology as today in the sense that it was a static image. It showed up on a website and it was loaded in addition to whatever organic content was already there on the web page. But the advertiser had to work directly with publisher 1. And then if you want to show it also on publisher 2's website, publisher 2. It was the equivalent of having to go out and have, as an advertiser in TV, to talk to every TV show out there. And so as you can imagine, that's very inefficient for an advertiser. So ultimately, the agency or the advertiser themselves would work with a network of publishers, sometimes called an ad network. And this network would take the advertiser's information and take the budget and figure out where, when, and how best to spend the advertising budget on various publishers, on various web apps, or ultimately, even today, some ad networks do it inside of mobile apps. But it's still the same idea. The user was seeing the ad after it was displayed on the publisher's website. Also, publishers started to get bigger and realize, wait a second, we don't want to have to deal with the agency or the ad network. Let's actually hire our own sales force. And you think about some of the large networks, some of the largest publishers out there, even today, have their own ad sales teams. And those ad sales teams are sometimes working directly with the advertiser. And so the advertiser sends over the information directly to the publisher sales team, and then an ad server determines when, where, and how to run that ad campaign. And then it may or may not send some of the additional inventory out to ad networks. So here's where we are today. We still have an advertiser over on the right-hand side, and that advertiser is still trying to reach that user, still trying to reach that same audience. They may still work with an agency. They may also, the agency may, rather than running a lot of things digitally in the middle, may have something called a trading desk, where they determine some of the efficient spend of various clients' ad campaigns themselves. And that campaign, regardless of who is initially setting it up, that campaign typically gets loaded into what's called the DSP. We'll talk about it in a minute, but it gets loaded in as a demand on the demand side platform, which runs a bidding service. Think of it as a buy side. The advertiser is contracting with a digital intermediary and saying to that intermediary, hey, as ad space becomes available, I would like you to buy, I would like you to take the dollars and demand to fill the ads there. On the sell side, the publishers, the ad networks, run their own supply side platforms. And they make that supply, that potential ad spot to be filled, they make that available. And typically SSPs and DSPs meet in some version of an ad exchange. Sometimes that ad exchange is a separate entity. Sometimes the SSP is running their own exchange. The important thing to realize is that these requests for ads to be filled coming from the app or coming from the publisher, those requests happen, and when they come into the exchange, there's a real-time auction. There could be upwards of 50 DSPs bidding, and that auction usually clears, someone wins that auction within as quick as 10 to 50 milliseconds. And so the whole round trip can sometimes be done in less than 100 milliseconds, all the way back to the user. This happens hundreds of billions times per day. And as reference, there's about 12 billion stocks, I believe, traded on the New York Stock Exchange. So the high-speed programmatic trading of this ad space is really a fascinating industry unto itself. And it deals with all the same types of issues that you would think about in any bilateral marketplace, liquidity, and whether it's a first price auction, second price auction, et cetera. So let's just talk about SSPs and DSPs. I think it's important to understand their motivation. They're ultimately there to enable publishers to maximize their fill rates and maximize the value of each ad, so maximize the revenue. They are specialists in this particular area. We've listed some names of them. They tend to change. Rubicon Project is now called Magnite. AppNexus, renamed Xandr, and then being now sold to Microsoft. I mean, there's a lot of ebb and flow. MoPub was bought by Twitter, but the core technology is still adopted by publishers, and they may sometimes say, well, here's SSP1 and then here's SSP2. Maybe they'll daisy chain them, or more and more, as the header of the web page is loaded, they'll run some bidding there, and there's something called header bidding, and we'll kind of mention that just to keep an eye on it. But it is something where actually Amazon started playing a lot more in that space thanks to header bidding. So on the demand side, remember this was over on the right-hand side, it's the digital intermediary. The SSP was acting on behalf of the publisher in these high-speed exchanges. The DSP is acting on behalf of the advertiser. It's enabling the advertiser to do all the sophisticated bidding across multiple ad formats. So it may be one budget, and then you want to optimize across publishers, across ad formats, all depending on when these ads are being shown, how efficiently, who's viewing them, who's clicking on them, and then who's ultimately converting. And this allows for some pretty sophisticated bidding algorithms, and then also works with a lot of other additional third parties to track the outcomes. If you are an advertiser, in 1994, you cared about your ROAS, your return on your advertising spend, and today, in 2022, you care about the same thing, that return on advertising spend. So you always, as a DSP, as any digital intermediary in the ad tech landscape, you always want to be tracking those outcomes so that you can say, look, advertiser, shoe brand XYZ, you spend $1 million in your current advertising techniques, and you get $2.5 million in sales. If you spend that same million with me, you can get $4 million in sales. And giving a company a quote unquote free extra $1.5 million is not a bad place to be if you are ultimately trying to do business with them. Just skipped over a little too quickly there. This is a landscape. If you're a CMO of that shoe brand, you are really having a tough time choosing which marketing and advertising technology vendors to work with. Every single one of those illegible icons there is a separate company. And even those clouds or collections of red, and blue circles, those are collections of chunks of the ad tech and martech landscape. It is very fragmented. There's a lot being done. And as much as we hear about the walled gardens, the large platforms controlling 3 large platforms control at least 70% of the advertising spend in the United States. As much as there's that consolidation, that 30% is still a pretty big market. And so there's a lot of confusion these days as to how a chief marketing officer spends effectively in order to acquire new users or retain existing ones.
All right, so jumping into what is real-time bidding, the different types of targeting that are available. When we talk about all of the instances where there are opportunities to optimize advertising, I look at these as basically a spectrum of different types of approaches to presenting relevant advertising. On the more benign end of it, or less controversial end of the spectrum, is contextual advertising. And we typically think of this as serving an ad based on the place where the ad will be presented. So for example, if you are on a travel website, you probably would not be surprised to receive an ad for luggage. Or if you are on a news article talking about the holidays, you may get a recipe for Christmas cookies or something to that effect. The content of the advertising is targeted based on the website where it will appear, as opposed to anything that it might know about the individual user. As you move down that spectrum and the ads become more targeted based on the individual user, we start seeing behavioral advertising, which is known under a variety of different names: behavioral advertising, cross-context advertising, or targeted advertising, tailored advertising, interest-based advertising. All of these words that you hear are basically variations of mechanisms for serving an ad based on something that is known about the individual user's behavior. So if you know that somebody has been perusing websites about cars, chances are they may be in the market for buying a car, and you can serve them an advertisement in another context completely unrelated to researching on a vehicle, but an auto ad. And that individual user may be more receptive to that advertisement, or it may be a more relevant interaction for them based on the fact that you know that they may be in the market for a vehicle. In a similar situation, another variation of behavioral advertising is retargeting. And this is a mechanism where an advertiser is able to serve an ad to a user that is in their, either in their customer database or has been to their website previously. We talked about tags earlier, and this is another mechanism that can be used for retargeting. So for example, if I go to the Nike website and I'm looking at a pair of shoes and I don't actually purchase the shoes, but later I go to another website that is providing me news of the day. And the web server that was present on the Nike website recognizes me when I am now on my news website and says, aha, this is the person who was looking at these shoes. This would be a great opportunity to serve them an ad for those shoes they didn't actually purchase. And this is the basis of retargeting. There are incredibly sophisticated mechanisms and technologies for doing different types of targeting, for doing segmentation, for creating different buckets of users in order to target ads to relevant audiences. But generally, I'm trying to give you the overview of the different types of targeting that might be used to present a relevant ad to an individual based either on the sites that they're visiting now or the sites they have visited, or information that an advertiser might have about the individual who is going to view the ad at that point in time. So when we talk about how sophisticated these systems are, we talk about programmatic or real-time bidding, and it is basically just the mechanism by which the ads can be served to the individual user in a really automated and incredibly fast process. So when I talk about how the ads are served in a real-time bidding context, the user goes to the website and my automation gives up on me. And that makes there it goes. Step one, the browser makes its connection to both the content delivery network, or a CDN, which is where the content for a page might be stored to optimize the presentation of a website. It also makes the connection to the ad server or the publisher website. And then in the next step, the ad server makes the the publisher makes the connection to the SSP. And once that connection is made, the ad exchange comes into play. And this is where that complex and super fast offering of inventory on a website and the auctioning of the ad space takes place. That would be step 4. On the opposite side, you have your advertisers, you have your DMP, which is your marketing platform and your DSP, who are going to also participate in the auction and have the ads that want to be presented. And they engage in this conversation about whether or not there is an interest in presenting an ad on a page, or if the user is one that the advertiser is trying to reach, how much you're willing to spend for that ad. And this is where that whole bidding process takes place. Once that bid has been presented, there is a connection between the DSP and their own content delivery network. This is where they retrieve the actual ad content that will be displayed, and it is communicated back to the browser, and the ad server actually presents the ad to on the website. It is placed in there. And all of this happens, as Adam says, in a microsecond. And the portion in the middle of the ad exchange all happens between multiple parties. Hundreds of thousands of interactions happen, billions per day of these conversations in a split second to try to optimize the serving of the ad to the individual user, both for the relevant advertising as well as to optimize the ad campaigns for advertisers. And this happens completely behind the scenes to the individual user. If done right, users will not see what's happening in this space. Now, outside of this, you've also heard the mention of header bidding. There is another mechanism on top of this real-time bidding interaction that could be a more, the word I'm thinking of is escaped me, but there's another mechanism by which preferred vendors could be going through an auction process as well before this bidding sequence happens. And
essentially a private marketplace.
Private marketplace. It started with a P. I had it in my head. So what's in a bid request? You don't actually get to see this. It happens automatically through the architecture of the actual sending of information in response to a real-time bidding opportunity. And this is basically what it looks like. Some of this might make sense to you reading through it. This is an example. All of the data fields that are here are not necessarily present in every interaction, but just to give you a glimpse of what could be in a bidding request, you have some of this information that seems human readable. There's going to be an ID for the placement of the ad. There's going to be some information about where the ad is going. So in this case, it's going to be on an answers.com website. There are some categories that are called out. Those categories, in this instance, this is the IAB's open RTB environment. So the IAB has a category assigned to the web page. In this case, it's category 27, and it calls out what the domain is, the page that the user's on. On the other side of the equation, you see some other information that is going to be relevant to the individual user that's visiting. In this case, we know that their browser language is set to English, their country is the United States. And in this instance, we happen to have latitude and longitude. Those are not always present. They may be something that can be provided depending on the type of the website, if they have access to that information on the device. But if that information is available, it can be included in the information that is passed along in a bid request. And then finally, there's going to be information about the individual user, their IP address, if there's an ID that is available for that specific user, that may also be passed along in a bid request. And all of this is done in a microsecond that allows for multiple parties to be able to determine if they want to bid on the inventory or the space available for placing the ad. And if so, then this information is used to influence the customization of the ad or the selection of the ad that will be presented. And then Adam, tell me how we do analytics on all of this.
Oh, yes. Now, analytics, the way you should think about it, everyone has a different definition of analytics in whatever field we're in. But I think that the best way to think about this is you can't manage what you can't measure is the cliche. And how are you going to manage the maximizing of that ROAS, that return on ad spend? How is one, as a marketer, as an advertiser, as a spender of this ad budget, how are you going to make the most effective return on that advertising marketing investment? And so the analytics breaks down into 4 main areas. Targeting. Do you have enough analytic data from, say, previous campaigns to define your campaign criteria? Should it be, males between the ages of 20 and 50? Well, it might be better to say males between the ages of 20 and 40, because people who buy your product are far less likely to be between the ages of 40 and 50, and therefore a lot of your spend will be wasted there. You need to be able to track this. So as the campaign is running, you need to be able to track certain attributes or information that is coming from the campaign itself, i.e. what's being passed in the request for an ad from the supply side, what's being bid upon, what price is being paid from the demand side. Once somebody sees an ad, are they looking at it? Are they looking at it for a long time? Are they clicking on it? Once they do click, are they signing up for your newsletter? Are they purchasing your product? And then measurement is the third area. After the campaign is done, how effectively can you measure which parts of the campaign worked and which didn't? How effectively can you measure the campaign and whether you were truly converting people, or were those people going to go and buy your product anyway? And then finally, the fourth area is insights. Once you have been able to measure effectively, you want to draw some insights, maybe over multiple campaigns. Maybe you want to draw insights from a particular segment of your campaign, and you want to target them again. So it does end up being a bit of a feedback loop. Set up the campaign for targeting and make sure you have the analytics for that. Track the data so that you can report into any analytics platform. Measure the campaign, its spend, who is targeting, was the time of day really effective? Are you targeting office workers? Well, middle of the day is going to be much better than 11 p.m. At night. And then what insights can you draw from multiple campaigns or from multiple audiences? And of course, that's going to feed back into the next campaign. So I'm getting a little too happy with these mouse clicks. So one of the things that's very important when tracking these analytics is to be able to measure when one individual is inside of one browser on one laptop, for instance, or one browser on a mobile device, then they happen to see that ad, they're exposed to that message. Maybe they're exposed multiple times on that same browser, and then they ultimately convert. If you know the identifier, and you don't have to know anything about the user in terms of personally identifiable information, if you know that identifier and you can track it, you can perform a lot of valuable analytics for the campaign itself. But then you can also, if you know a little bit more of metadata or maybe non-personally identifiable information, maybe it's a wide age band, you can perform other uses. You can make use of that identifier. So you can prevent fraud. You can find identifiers of individuals and making sure that they're only seeing ads in a sort of brand safe universe. You can, as we're all aware, as privacy practitioners, you can allow people to opt out if a identifier persists, because then you can persist the consent, the choice that the user has made to opt out of targeted advertising, for instance. You can improve the user experience. We've mentioned measurement. And then ultimately, you can see that that identifier has traveled through multiple channels, and you can attribute more effectiveness to one channel over the other. So we're going to talk a lot about identifiers, but be mindful of the fact that even though there's a lot of privacy attention focused on the commercial nature, the advertising nature of these identifiers, there are a lot of other uses, as we mentioned on the right-hand side, that aren't always directly related to the campaign itself. So what do some of these identifiers look like? How are they captured? Christy talked about cookies before, and you, I'm sure, have seen in the news that cookies are facing a lot of limitations. And then there's alternative technologies coming up. So we want to focus on these identifiers and either how they're being used as alternative technologies or being used as a inside of a cookie. So we like to say the cookie is crumbling. It's a good metaphor to play around with. But even before this cookie apocalypse that some people have been referring to recently, there's a lot of drivers that have reduced the effectiveness of cookies. Cookies have their limitations, only identifying user within a single browser. If you are an application that a user can access, say a streaming music platform, user can access it inside of a laptop's browser, but also on a smartphone device. It's not, the cookie really isn't a very effective technology for that. And more as mobile has arisen, and we're going to touch on the fact that mobile grew up in an environment where it wasn't de facto using cookies, whereas on the desktop web, laptops, web experience, cookies were sort of the norm inside of a browser. So as the percentage of browsing goes up, the effectiveness of cookies has in various places gone down. A lot of activity inside of apps is not supported by the cookie. There's a lot of issues around platforms and consumer software and various devices that just do not make use of cookies or give very limited visibility to cookies. And so let's just focus though on the places where the cookie is used a lot and the various issues we should be aware of, or the categories to be aware of. First, cookies in a first-party context, those have a lot less restrictions around them. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you see that first row and the three different browsers or three different columns there and how they handle cookies in a first-party context. Remember what Christy talked about earlier. If I am a particular internet service app browser platform and I'm working directly, I'm connecting and creating an experience directly with a user, that's a first-party relationship. And if I'm never going outside to bring in third parties, even just for measurement, tracking, analytics purposes, forget about advertising. If I'm never going out to a third party, then I really just care about this first row for the most part. If I am working with third parties, if I have a lot of interconnected mechanics where I depend on vendors, and especially if I'm sending certain types of data to intermediaries, and that's the way advertising is done. Remember, we talked about the publisher sending information to the supply side platform and or the SSP sending it into the exchanges. That's all happening where they're exchanging cookies in a third-party context. So that second row is a lot more relevant for us. The browsers have been very conscious of these third-party contexts and how it can at times veer away from what the user's assumptions are about the context of the usage or what the users assumed was being done with their data from the beginning. And so they've built in protection mechanisms. That's the third row. They've also set those protection mechanisms as a default, because often they've found users just want to be protected. Sometimes it shuts the user off from certain experiences, and various websites have tried over time to accommodate that, or at least notify the user of some of those default protections being turned on. And then finally, there are ways that they classify non-trackers. So they're not turning on a default protection mode, but you can have classification of some of these tracking mechanisms. Some of these third-party technologies end up tracking you, and you may not truly be aware unless the browser's doing something to classify and notify you. Cookies, of course, are not the panacea, and a lot of companies have been preparing themselves for alternatives. And there's a lot of reasons why they do that. There's a lot of commercial drivers, there's a lot of industry drivers as to why these alternatives are coming up. From publishers' perspective, they want to, of course, maximize ad prices, fill rates, and their analytic value. So if there's an alternative, especially as cookies start to be threatened or their future is uncertain, they'll naturally adopt it. We've talked about advertisers wanting to maximize their spend. But also, we saw with GDPR, it has a big impact on a lot of cookie alternatives. We've talked, we're mentioning here Google's Flock, which has now been relaunched as Topics. But a lot of these segment-based or micro segments or micro cohorts, you'll hear them referred to as, where it's not, if there is any kind of identifier, it's not something that can be mapped to an individual. It may be mapped to an affinity, a collection of interests, a collection of non-identifiable, personally identifiable attributes. Apple as a platform has made some decisions that have definitely impacted the alternative to cookies and how IDs are being used. And you know, there's a lot of impacts here, and you know, a lot of publishers more and more are using these identifiers, sometimes in a first-party context, and more advertisers are saying, even before they start the campaign, I even heard this week at a conference, top advertisers say, I'm not going to run, if I'm going to run outside of the walled gardens, I'm not even going to run a campaign unless I know it is showing up on an individual, or unless I'm very, very clear on the context, unless I'm very clear on the context in which I'm advertising there. So what do we think about now that we understand some of the drivers there? What are some of the implications for some of these identifiers after this cookie apocalypse starts to take effect? Well, people are going to find new ways to track and identify audiences. I don't mean that in a nefarious way. There are a lot of well-intentioned actors out there who are focused on innovation and trying to find ways to just identify audiences. Maybe it's something as simple as just running more effective surveys, panels, and then finding people who have similar behaviors rather than tracking people at an individual level. There's a lot, I mentioned contextual targeting. You may want to just track moviegoers, movie lovers, people who love horror movies. First-party data is becoming a big thing, especially when you start to see some of the restrictions that was mentioned earlier about CPRA and multi-site targeting or cross-context, behavioral and interest tracking. The notion of first-party data where an advertiser is working directly with a publisher and that publisher has gathered that first-party data. Then third-party data, third-party identifiers for advertising are going to be severely limited over time, and a lot of not just the platforms, but also data privacy regimes look askance at that. And then third-party identifiers, though, may still be used. They'll just be used maybe for more narrow purposes. So just because you start to associate third-party identifiers as something that could be misused, or people's data could be out there and persist while it's attached to a third-party identifier, don't assume that there aren't some legitimate purposes there for it. And of course, it's changing how publishers monetize their ad inventory. They may package it up in different ways in their media kits. So some of the deterministic identifier alternatives, it's just simple as the user logs in with an email address. I got a service on desktop, as I mentioned, that music example of a music streaming service. I like to stream it at work. And then when I'm on the go, I log in on the app. Same information, it can be matched. And I, as a first party service, can make sure that I am providing someone with all the relevant history that they're used to receiving. There's also, rather than deterministic linkage and saying it's an email address in the desktop and on the mobile, there are a lot of probabilistic mechanisms. Maybe it's a high-level IP address combined with various algorithmically derived or probabilistically developed, if that's a term, algorithms that let me know that I'm seeing the same person. Maybe it's over a short period of time, and it can degrade. But one of the areas that got, I don't know who was the marketing genius who called it fingerprinting early on, because fingerprinting does carry a various, it carries a nefarious tone around it. But if you look down here, this is an actual example, correct me if I'm wrong, Christy, this may have even been on one of your clean browsers that you set up, but this was a clean browser, and we set it up and we request just one web page. And all the information that is in that browser, it's usually called the user agent, all that information can be sent on. What plugins, what version of an operating system are you on? What time zone are you in? What's your IP address? What's your screen resolution? And here's sometimes a kicker. If your office has a custom font that they use, that can immediately make you a lot more of an identifiable fingerprint and easier to track. And so this is sort of the old sarcastic or sardonic cliche. Just remember you're unique, just like everyone else, but you are unique among this many other fingerprints in this fingerprinting technologies server-side database. So they receive that unique permutation of all these different aspects of the user agent, and they're able to track. Now, it's very effective to track over, say, 24 hours, 72 hours, over a small number of days. Once you start getting into multiple weeks, fingerprints degrade. So that's good in some ways, right? Privacy protection, but it can also be bad because if you want to persist somebody's opt-out choice, it's hard to do that if you're attaching it to an identifier that degrades. Let's see what's going on.
Then we move into what happens in the mobile context. And all of us today who have mobile phones have probably seen the permissions prompts that either Apple or Android, depending on your preference, will present. So anytime there are more sensitive data elements that need to be collected or accessed, either to directly provide a service within the app or to collect data for customization or whatever purposes, you'll see prompts for things like this app wants to have access to your precise location or your course location, or it may need access to your microphone or other sensor data. And we've seen those types of prompts. As the mobile ecosystem has evolved and these data elements have the policies around accessing these sorts of data have evolved, the technology has also enhanced in a way that we have seen the introduction of identifiers specific to the advertising space. So you've probably heard of the IDFA or the Google Android advertising ID, either the AAID or the GAID. These came about in 2013, 2014. They have similar architecture in that both of the operating systems present an advertising identifier that can be used, or an identifier that can be used in the advertising context. And developers are instructed to use these identifiers specifically for advertising and marketing purposes, as opposed to other identifiers that may not have the level of transparency or control that we have come to expect in an advertising context. So your device ID, the hard-coded ID that is assigned to your device, is not now tied to the advertising context. Instead, that identifier is necessary for certain purposes, but when an entity is engaging in an advertising purpose, they will turn to these other identifiers. To go along with this, we have seen the evolution of permissions that go with these identifiers. So in the Apple context, you have likely seen the prompts for the app tracking transparency framework that presents an option for users to ask an app not to track or to allow. This is a more granular level control. If in the Apple context, a user does not provide consent to the tracking, then that IDFA, or the ID for advertisers, is not provided by the device for advertising purposes. And the app is then provided with a flag that indicates that this user does not want to be tracked and should then, according to the platform policies, not engage in tracking, even using other mechanisms. For example, the fingerprinting or other mechanisms that Adam was describing. Google is creating something similar in that they also have an ID for advertising. They have a mechanism for users to clear that. They have policies around the use of that identifier. We are also seeing the introduction of more transparency in the mobile context when it comes to identifiers or just data collection and use and the various purposes for that data collection and use. So on the Apple platform, we see the privacy nutrition label, which is a more condensed version of a privacy policy of sorts that explains in some iconography and brief language what that app is doing with data, what data it collects, and how it might use it. Google is launching a similar feature as well in the coming months. So we are right now in the midst of the testing and rollout of that, but look forward to similar structures there. The approaches of the different platforms will have their own nuances based on the users of those devices and the way that those systems work. But the general approach is similar in that there needs to be a mechanism for transparency to users and mechanisms for controlling the flows of data in those contexts. And when I start thinking about what's on the horizon, I want to draw your attention just to not only the legislation that is influencing the changes to the advertising ecosystem. I know that as lawyers or people working in the legal profession, you are very familiar with the existing and emerging legislation. But it's also important to understand that these conversations and these business models are highly influenced by things like the platforms that are providing the place for this advertising to happen, or for services to be provided, and the defaults that those platforms and services present also dictate a lot of what can happen in this space. So when browsers make changes, or when the mobile operating systems make changes, or we see the the multi-stakeholder processes such as the W3C, who does the internet standards conversations and setting, those frameworks will also influence what can and should be done in the context of advertising or provision of services. And then there are the companies that are engaging in these things directly. They have their own processes, their own frameworks, and you have likely heard of organizations like the IAB or PRAM, which is the Partnership for Responsible Addressable Media. These are and individual companies that may be presenting their own proprietary solutions. They also have a sway in how these ecosystems will evolve and how business models evolve and how data will flow in this context. And with that, I will open it up to questions. I'm sure you still have them. I can't answer everything in the brief time, but happy to take questions that may have come in.
Thank you so much. I am just going to ask a question. First of all, this was so helpful for all of us lawyers. And all of us lawyers, as you well know, we are talking to clients about opting out. And we do have a whole session that's going to be devoted to the global opt-out and whatnot. But can you just flag for us how that might happen? And with particularly that slide that you had that shows the request, and how do opt-outs work in the system that you've described to us?
So I think it depends on the specific platform that you're on. If you're in a browser context and you are a company that operates by using cookies to track your users, then you will likely have a cookie-based opt-out. And that's what we see in a lot of cases with, you're probably familiar with things like your online ad choices, or the NAI opt-out. These are some of the industry opt-outs that you've probably seen in either icons within ads or within privacy policies of sites. Basically what happens in that instance, there's a cookie that is set. That cookie indicates that the user has opted out. And so when that conversation happens between a browser and a server, that opt-out preference is sent over, and it is on the entity to then respect that. Typically what happens in a lot of those cases, I can't say it's all of them, but typically what you will see is that instead of having a unique identifier in a cookie, that cookie will read opt-out or 0 or something that doesn't have the unique identifier. So it indicates to the receiving party, this person has opted out, and it also means that there is no unique identifier there that would allow them to track that individual user over time. It basically puts them in a bucket with all of the other opted out users. And that's similar to what we see in the mobile context. If a user does not choose to opt in to tracking in the Apple context, the ID is not passed along. Instead, there is a sequence of zeros that are passed along, and every user who has opted out looks like one giant pool of people. It does not allow for the individual to be identified in that context. And these are generalizations. There are other approaches to it, but in general, that's the basic concept of how these opt-outs work.
Sorry, I was unmuted. Okay, great. Stacy, did you want to handle some of the questions, or?
That was a great question to start us off with, Sherry. We had a couple of more flow through the chat earlier. One that I sort of want to return to, even though I think it was answered to that person directly, was the effect of clearing cookies. So especially folks that maybe are used to doing this over the years with some of the older browsers, clearing cookies. What impact on that with respect to online tracking, online advertising, opt-outs?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I think it's important to highlight that, yes, you can clear cookies, and that can clear a lot of historical data, but it also has the impact, can have the impact of clearing your opt-out choice along the way. Even before all this cookie apocalypse, this was 10 years ago. If you were running a campaign, you would always assume any cookie you set, that a good 100% of the cookies were deleted over 90 days. So every 30 days, 30% of the cookie, 33% of the cookies you were setting were going to be deleted. It was that order of magnitude. It always varies by user segment, but that's an important consideration. And of course, if you're deleting a cookie that was an opt-out for, say, some platform-wide or multi-site choice, then that's going to go away as well. Sorry, Christy, did you have anything to add?
No, I was agreeing. I was hanging my head, because you're right. If you have an opt-out cookie and you delete all of your cookies, you've basically eliminated your messaging that you've opted out and have to re-enable that. So basically what happens is, if you clear your cookies, your browser appears as if you are a brand spanking new user to every website that you go to. And while the information that may have been stored about previous visits does not get deleted from the server, there is nothing when you clear your cookies in your browser, it does not reach out to all of the companies that have cookies stored to tell them that information has been deleted. It just deletes it from the browser. And what happens in that instance is basically the information stored by the server is orphaned. It will never be recognized in the future when that browser comes back to that website, because that cookie can't be matched on both ends, or that unique identifier can't be matched on both ends. The information that a website may have known about an individual is just sitting in their system without ever being able to link it back to that first browser. There are nuances to this where, we've had instances in the past where cookies could be relinked. For example, if you are using a logged in experience, if I clear my cookies, then I look like a new user, but when I log back into a website that knows me by putting in my username and password, all the information on the server can then be linked back. That company now knows who I am because I've told them again who I am. Cookies aren't necessary for retaining the experience in that instance. So it is possible to still recognize a user, but if you are relying solely on cookies, deleting a cookie means you are a whole new person in the eyes of that server.
Do you have a sense if regulators understand that?
Probably not. We know cookies are fragile. We know people recognize that they are not completely reliable. We also recognize that that cookies are not a sufficient solution for all opt-outs, because they are not present in all interactions. That's where I think some of the conversations around the appeal of a global privacy control. I understand the appeal of that, but technologically, I don't think it's quite as simple as we would like it to be. It's not a binary switch, but I know there are a lot of really smart tech folks who are working on ways to try to identify mechanisms that could be used by a multitude of companies to present a consistent preference in multiple different contexts.
And that's what we'll be talking about in 2 weeks. Thanks, Christy. Before that, of course, we'll have next week's session, which you're also welcome to join us for, on dark patterns and manipulative design. So register for those 2 events coming up at fpf.org or fpf.org/events. I just want to say a huge thank you to Christy Harris again, and to Adam again. Thank you, Adam, and to Taylor, who has joined us, but we ended up not having more time to hear from you. But a fantastic presentation at the start. And we did not even have time to get to all the questions. So folks who are still on, if you have more questions, please do follow up. We put the contact information up on the screen, and we'll be sending this around afterwards, early next week, to everyone who's registered. All right, well, from me and Sherry, thank you all. Have an excellent weekend, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.